Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to our podcast edition of Listening to America, 10 Things about the Jefferson-Adams Correspondence. Sometimes I lose some of my zeal for Mr. Jefferson. There are things about him that are frustrating, as about everyone, of course. And there is a level of evasiveness or even duplicity in his character at times. The problem is that Jefferson could not just be a man of letters and a scientist and an exemplar of the Enlightenment. He could not just be a classifier of library collections, an amateur paleontologist, America's foremost architect. If he had never been involved in politics, it'd be easier for us to see consistency in his character. But the worst thing that can happen to an ideologue is that she or he holds power. And when you hold power, you essentially have to moderate your views in order to lead a nation, in order to get things done. And Jefferson did. He was close to being a kind of quasi-federalist during his 2 terms as president of the United States. So being an ideologue, and Jefferson truly was a political radical with a very strong agrarian vision of exceedingly limited and local government, a nation that was isolationist and minded its own business and turned its back on the havoc of the rest of the world. In spite of that ideology, which is a very powerful ideology in Jefferson, he's not a pragmatist, really. He was able to play a pragmatist when he held power, and this frustrated people like John Randolph of Roanoke and others. The other problem for Jefferson is slavery, of course. It would be so much easier to revere Thomas Jefferson, in spite of politics, if it hadn't been for race and slavery, which were a toxic cocktail that damaged him, damaged others, damaged this nation. The original sin of America came in 1619 when that first Dutch ship came and slavery got its footing. But he isn't one of the big, great presidents like Washington or Lincoln or FDR, because he read the presidency in this very low-key way, and he never took himself too seriously as a world historical figure. It's hard to really know where to place the lever with Jefferson to figure him out. And if anybody ever tried to figure him out, it was John Adams. We didn't get to say this during the program, but I think John Adams genuinely loved Jefferson. I mean, he actually loved him. It wasn't just like throwing that word around. He loved Thomas Jefferson, and he grieved over the loss of the friendship, and he ached, and he felt bereft because Jefferson had once been one of the central figures of Adams' life, and he wanted Jefferson's friendship, and he wanted Jefferson's approval. He wanted Jefferson to see the world in many respects as he, John Adams, saw it, and that Jefferson didn't and wouldn't was deeply upsetting to him. And so the correspondence is in some sense Adams trying to make the case for himself and to score a few points against his old friend and adversary, Thomas Jefferson. Remember, at this time, Jefferson is riding very high. He's the senior member of the Virginia dynasty, and he's in splendid retirement with his spectacular gardens and his many intellectual projects. He's just creating the University of Virginia. He's a man of deep classical serenity and stoicism. He's gracious to pure strangers. His hospitality is enormous, in fact, financially crippling. And he's an American hero. His side won, as Lindsay puts it in this program. The Federalists are in disarray. John Adams at this point is at a low ebb, essentially forgotten in many circles, and desperately in need of some sort of vindication, some sort of an understanding that he was central to the whole project of American independence and the early national period. And he's not getting that admiration that he so desperately needs, in a way that Jefferson takes his soul solacing in a different way from intellectual friendships and from his family, from his little world. And he's not that concerned with the public's view of him, or at least so he says. At any rate, we could have talked for 10 hours about this, and we will talk more. And in a few weeks, we'll do Jefferson and Abigail Adams Correspondence, 10 Things. I think it's a remarkable thing to see this young, brilliant woman And this much older Chautauquan, man, she's heading into the Empyrean, I think, amongst American historians. Just watch her career. But it's such fun, and I always look forward to Lindsay because we're both terribly busy. Let's go to the program if you can help us. I just had my annual financial meeting today with my accountants and my manager, and we do need money for Listening to America, particularly for this grand thing that I'm about to do starting on May 2nd to drive America in the wake of John Steinbeck's 1960 Travels with Charlie tour. If you can help us achieve this great dream, we'll be absolutely thrilled. I think there are a few places left on the summer Lewis and Clark trip. Please sign up. It will fill soon, but it's the trip of trips. 2.5 days on the Missouri River in the White Cliffs section in canoes, camping where they camped, sleeping where they slept, talking about Lewis and Clark, but about much more too. To the following late June or July when we go up to see the world of Lewis and Clark in this marvelous, marvelous way. So go to the website ltamerica.org. You'll see my dispatches, my postings, the videos. Now there are videos of Lindsay and I talking together. So we've pulled some video off of the Riverside or Zoom recording, and we're sharing a little bit with you so you can see, the really snarky eye rolling that she's engaged in much of the time. So let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. Across from me, across the country, is Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, my friend and my colleague in the 10 Things series. Today, 10 things about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and their correspondence. One of the great subjects. Lindsay, my friend Patricia Limerick, the great Patricia Limerick, the Western historian, used to teach a course in which the Jefferson-Adams letters came up, and she said when she would get to the end of her life, she would slow down because she didn't want them to die. Do you have that feeling at all? Like that? Do you warm to this correspondence?
I do. I think that their relationship was so unique, and so I think it reveals a lot about both of them to the reader in a way that few other relationships did. I think that the nation felt a great sorrow when they passed, not just because they had died and their contributions, but it almost, like a lot of people say that when you lose your parents, you feel like you're an adult for the first time because all of a sudden there's no parent left. And I think the nation felt that way. Like they were gone and all of a sudden that generation is not there to help. And I think that is probably a very scary moment. And I think it's impossible to not have a sense of that when you're reading, especially towards the end, because they knew it was coming. So they weren't surprised.
And everybody knows, of course, that they died on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And they had been 2 of the 5 members of the committee to draft the Declaration, and the 2 most important ones at that, Adams, born 1735, Jefferson, born 1743, so 8 years younger, and that comes up a little bit sometimes in the correspondence. Adams regards himself as sort of the senior brother or the senior member or the mentor almost of Thomas Jefferson. I wonder how Jefferson actually felt about that. But they were friends, and then they were enemies. Well, let's put it this way. They were friends, and they were then frenemies, and then they were sort of enemies, and then they worked it out. Amazing, really, because, well, first of all, do you think that this mattered? I mean, the country sort of knew this in some circles, that they had reconciled and they were exchanging letters, and there was even a suggestion that maybe they published some of them. Do you think it mattered to the country that these 2 formidable founders worked things out?
I do. I think it mattered a great deal, especially if we look at the context of what was happening when they died. And they talked about that context a lot in their correspondence. So they died a few years after the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, which I think everyone understood was probably not a long-term solution on slavery because it said that above a certain parallel, the states would be free, and below that parallel, people could bring their enslaved property to those states. And so everyone knew that that wasn't really solving the problem long-term, but it was hopefully a really good Band-Aid and would allow future generations to try and come up with a more creative solution that they couldn't yet foresee. And so in some ways, when Adams and Jefferson came back together and were talking, it felt like, okay, well, maybe we can actually get past these divisions. They were the first generation of, really really divided partisans, and they were able to get past it. So maybe we too can get past our divisions. And I think it meant a lot to a lot of Americans and the people, especially the people who knew them both, that they were able to retain a good relationship at the end.
Adams is from Massachusetts. Jefferson is from Virginia. Tell me if I'm wrong. Jefferson's not really a full-on Southerner in the sort of John Calhoun sense, and Adams isn't really a full-on Northerner in the Timothy Pickering, Rufus King sense. That they were both essentially moderates, don't you think?
I think that they were mostly moderates. I think there were times, not on slavery, but there were times when Jefferson was probably more radical than Adams was on certain things,
Quite a
but
bit.
not when it came to the slavery question. He was not articulating a positive good argument about slavery, which people like John C. Calhoun would come to embody. And I wonder how much of that is, when I'm doing a lot of my writing, and as I was writing this book, I couldn't help but really reflect that people like Timothy Pickering had never really left the country. And it's really easy to have strong opinions about things when you haven't seen the world. And I wonder how much of some of their moderation came from the fact that they were worldly, they were traveled, they had seen other cultures, they had experienced other cultures. And it didn't necessarily mean that they always thought well of those other cultures. Certainly, sometimes they could see real flaws. But I do think that it made them a little bit more balanced in their perspective because they just had a much broader view of the world.
I'm talking with my friend Lindsay Chervinsky, 10 things about the Jefferson-Adams correspondence, and really we're picking it up in 1812 when they renewed the correspondence. But per that, I don't think Timothy Pickering ever saw North Carolina or Georgia or Tennessee. I mean, in other words, he wasn't even outside of his own zone, much less outside of the country. So slavery would have seemed like an abomination to him, a corruption. He would have had no way of kind of absorbing how complicated this situation was.
Yes, he also was a particularly extreme example of a way to be a human. There's a line
Wow.
in the Elkins and McKittrick book
Wait.
called Age of Federalism, where they
Oh, I like
say
that book.
that it's I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that it reads like fiction, but it is an extraordinary magnum opus of the time period, and as a source material.
Say it again. Who wrote it?
Stanley Elkins and Eric McKittrick.
It's a tome in the fullest sense of tome, but it's an indispensable encyclopedic guide to the 1790s.
Totally. I mean, and if you are wanting to know what is happening on any given moment, much like in some ways Dumas Malone's work on Jefferson, it's really helpful as a starting point to kind of place yourself in that time period. But they have this line where they're talking about Pickering, and they say that he, came from Puritan, really kind of rough upbringing, a lot of kids in the family, not a lot of money, had to work really hard. And they said, then again, maybe that's not fair to the Puritans to blame them for Pickering's personality. And I love that line so much that I actually included it in my book because I just think it's such a good encapsulation of he was so intense that maybe he would have made even the Puritans uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analysis of Timothy Pickering. I love it.
Dropping into a conversation when I was writing my book is such a pretentious thing to do. I'm really glad you called me out on that.
No, it's not pretentious at all. It's fantastic. And when I talk to Joe Ellis, he invariably says on any subject, well, I wrote a book about that in 1985. And you think, wow, I wish I could say that. So let's start there. 10 things about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, their late correspondence with Lindsay Chervinsky. You've read this correspondence before, or certainly read in it. Now you wrote this book about Adams, so you had to read it, of course. And it's one of the delights of any study of these two great American founders. What was different this time? Because now you are, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but you are an Adams partisan this time.
I am. Yeah, no, that's fair. I think what is different about it is because I feel like I know him much better, as much as one can know a historical subject, of course, that's, many hundreds of years removed. I have a much better sense of who he is. And so I can see the moments where his irrepressible nature are coming out, where his joy and his humor, and he just really can't quite help himself, and he has to keep poking Jefferson about various things. And I love that about him. I find it so endearing and so amusing and so entertaining. And I'm sure sometimes Jefferson felt that way, and sometimes he also found it to be very annoying. I think he both loved and was annoyed by Adams. And So you can really see that in the correspondence. And I think that's been the really fun part this time around.
So I've read it, the correspondence, dozens of times, and I'm always thrilled to read it. I have some favorites, of course, but the sense I get, Lindsay, is that Adams is always saying, you want to fight about this? You want to fight about this? Here's something that really bothered me. That still bothers me. I'm not going to let this go. You want to fight about this? And Jefferson's like, the weather has been cloudy, and my granddaughters seem to be thriving, and it looks like a good year for crops. And by the way, I've been reading this really extraordinary book. And Adams is like, yeah, but I want to fight about this. Can't we fight about this? I'm really upset. You've never really come to terms with your contradictions, Mr. Jefferson.
Well, I think sometimes it's that. And sometimes he genuinely wanted to get at their contradictions and their past conflicts, because I think he was deeply looking for closure and wanted Jefferson to understand him and wanted to understand Jefferson in a way that is very Adams, and Jefferson was deeply uncomfortable. But then there are also moments where... Why was Jefferson uncomfortable with that?
Why was Jefferson uncomfortable with that?
Well, he would have had to reckon with his internal discrepancies. And there are letters where he basically says that, introspection and talking about feelings and thinking about feelings is unproductive. And self-reflection is a very important part of self-improvement. And so I think that would have been an uncomfortable experience for him. Whereas Adams, it was required as part of his, congregationalist upbringing. You had to self-reflect because you had to reflect on your failures in order to improve them. But I think there were also moments where, Adams loved a good debate. Even if it wasn't a fight in the negative sense, he loved to grapple with ideas and concepts. And, he loved nothing more than a long meal in which you were really going back and forth. And there are, I think, few people, to Jefferson's credit, who could have given as good as they got from Adams because he was such an impressive intellect. And Jefferson was too. So here Adams was thinking, I have someone who can really push me and we can think through these things. And Jefferson's like, do we have to?
Can't we talk about the books we're reading and the West and the origins of American Indians, or possibly the problems of Christianity? But Adams, okay, let's say that he didn't always want to fight, but he had some scores to settle, and not just with Jefferson. Adams, all of his life, felt that he wasn't understood. And he keeps saying to Jefferson, I've written more than almost anybody, and yet nobody understands me. They think I'm a monarchist. They think that I'm an aristocrat. They think that I don't, and he's constantly saying, why haven't I been understood? Jefferson's view was, hey, they're your words out there. You wrote these things. You exposed yourself in this way. Don't blame us for ascertaining from your writings what we have. And Jefferson's view was, I just want harmony. I mean, Jefferson didn't have anything to prove at this point. He didn't feel like, well, tell me, you think he did?
No, I don't think he did, but I think that that's exactly right. I mean, Jefferson won. He beat John Adams in the election, and his party won out, and his proteges won, and
it was his world now.
Yeah, it was his world. And, it's not to say that there wasn't another vision of the United States. I think the Hamiltonian vision came back into vogue later, but he won. And so he didn't have anything to prove because he was celebrated as this incredible figure and the author of the Declaration of Independence and all of these things. And Adams was like, excuse me, there's a little bit more nuance to this story.
Jefferson's my protege.
He did have, I do think that Adams, he may have benefited from a good editor on some of his writing to reduce some of the clutter and the confusion. But I do think he sometimes also did have a point. There were times when people did intentionally misunderstand what he was saying. And maybe that's because they were either cherry picking a section or it suited their political purposes. But he sometimes was misunderstood, and I don't blame him for being annoyed by that.
We need to take a break. I'm talking with my friend Lindsay Chervinsky about one of my favorite subjects, the Jefferson-Adams relationship. We'll be back in just a moment. This is Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, across from me, across the country from me. We're talking about 10 things about the famous Jefferson-Adams correspondence, 1812 to 1826. They exchanged 158 letters. Adams wrote about 3 for every one of Jefferson, and Jefferson often apologizes and says, I'm sorry, I've been busy in the fields, and I built a university. I don't know what you've been doing, but I built a university, and
Yeah, he also talked about how many letters he received, and he did receive more letters than Adams because he was this, very famous person, and he felt like he had to respond to almost all of them. And Adams at one point was like, "Don't worry about it. I'm just going to keep writing to you, and you respond when you feel like it." And I just love that about him, that he's like, "Nope, I'm just going to keep going."
What did Adams say to others about the renewed friendship with Jefferson? Because frequently each of them is very civil to each other, and then they're a little more snarky in writing to their pals.
Yeah, so I think both of them, had a little bit of defense mechanism going on in the event that people were critical, or they knew that this correspondence at some point was going to be read. And so they kind of wanted, if it was read before they died, they kind of wanted to be a little defensive. So Jefferson would sort of like play it off and, oh, well, we're just writing occasionally. And Adams would say, well, we were never enemies, so it's not really a big deal. And this is where the protege concept came in. He was like, how could I hate my protege? I was his mentor.
Preceptor all those years.
Yeah. So of course, but Jefferson uses the same sort of inverse to his advantage. He's like, Adams has always been my senior. Of course I'm going to talk to him. And so they kind of try to downplay the historic nature of it, to downplay the significance of it, to downplay the fact that they've come back together. And then also kind of point out where the other is maybe being ridiculous. So at one point, Adams asked Jefferson, when Madison was president, to help or to put in a good word for a judicial nominee. And Jefferson's like, sure, I'll try. And he writes to Madison, he's like, no, this person is a arch Federalist, not happening. And then he writes back to Adams and he's like, oh, I'm sorry, my letter got there too late. Oops. And on the flip side, Adams, kind of smooths Jefferson's feathers about the Declaration, because a copy of the Muhlenberg Declaration came out and people were like, oh, did Jefferson copy, from this to get his words? And Adams is like, of course he didn't. He says this to Jefferson, of course you didn't. And this is, not a real. And then, to other people, he was like, obviously he did. So there was a little bit of white lies going on both sides.
And then, of course, remember in 1824, J.Q. Adams is running for president, and Jefferson actually supports somebody else, but he makes Adams believe that he thinks this is good. I'm really glad for you. Congratulations. Your son was important to me during those years in France. And then to his partisan friends, he's saying, my real choice is somewhere else. So they did this little white lies, which one does in a correspondence with an old friend. And I think both of them were afraid. Do you agree that they might do something that would explode the magic, that it would end again?
Yes, I think especially in the beginning when they were first starting the conversation. So, during the War of 1812 and afterwards, they are very careful about trying not to offend the other, to be very gentle about it, to make sure they're sort of tiptoeing away from difficult subjects.
Does Jefferson's civility upset you? Because it could be seen as evasive or duplicitous, but this is his natural style, is this kind of lovely, slightly formal Enlightenment civility.
It doesn't bother me that he is doing it in this particular instance, but as a general principle, I think we've talked about this, it does make me like him less.
But even in this correspondence, you don't think, oh, come on, Jefferson, Adams wants you to talk about this. Why won't you talk about this?
I guess to a certain extent, you kind of got to wonder, he has nothing to lose. He's had all of the positions, and he's not going back into public life. And he knows, especially towards the end, he knows he's at the end of his life. So why not be a little bit more real with Adams? But I think that that's one of the things that always kind of drives me crazy about him, is he's just always a little bit closed off.
Amazing letter that John Adams writes to Jefferson during the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise, as you said, was that a new state would come in as a slave state in balance for a new state that was a free state. The Southerners really wanted to protect the balance in the Senate because they feared that if there were an overwhelming New England majority or Northern majority in Congress, that slavery would start to be eliminated or regulated or damaged. And so keeping the balance in the Senate was almost the whole thing. even more than extension of slavery into the West. It was the balance in the Senate, the balance in the Senate. When Jefferson learned about the Missouri Compromise, he said this is the death knell of the nation, because now there's an artificial line between North and South, and it's just going to grow worse. And it's like hearing a fire bell in the night. And I'm sorry that I lived to see our children, squander the great blessings of, it's a wonderful letter, a little bit defensive. But what I love is the Adams letter, Lindsay, where he says, you tell me if I've got it wrong, but he says, I've never really raised this question with you because it's a delicate one, and you're Southerners, you know more, and you're good men. I trust you, Washington, you, Monroe, Madison. These are all good men, and it's not for somebody on the outside. But when I see what's going on now, I have these nightmares of armies marching in the night, black versus white. And he says, again, I never really wanted to put this to you because I feel a genuine desire to defer to you and others. I love that letter, don't you?
I do, because he's not saying that this isn't going to be a problem. He knows it's going to be a problem, and he's known for a long time, and John Quincy Adams has known for a long time, but he's really, I think, trying to give his friend the benefit of the doubt. He does, however, say in the letter, he says, God will be the judge. So he's not sparing the morality of the question, but
he never in that correspondence says, I need you to explain how you can live with this fundamental contradiction in the very ideas that you are the nation's leading champion of. He never points that finger and demands, a term he uses from time to time in the correspondence, he says, in the French sense, but he never demands of Jefferson a full-on wrestle this thing to the ground for me.
No, he doesn't. And, it's an interesting conversation because we've talked about the fact that this was a subject that people did not bring up with Jefferson. So the fact that Jefferson and Adams are even mentioning it is kind of huge, circling the subject. And, Adams definitely had thoughts. At various points, he writes about how corrosive the institution was to humanity, both to the people that were held in bondage, but also the people that were holding others in bondage, and how it led to just pernicious things like Sally Hemings. So he had thoughts. He just
spared.
It's one of the few times he shows restraint.
So much for slavery. It's amazing that they'd been friends for 50 years or 40 some when Adams finally broached the subject really for the first time, maybe in conversation, but I doubt it. Why did the friendship break down, Lindsay? At one point, these two Argonauts, Jefferson loves these ship metaphors. We were poling our oars on the same seas through heavy water. We finally came into port, and then suddenly, what happened?
So initially, they both return to the United States, not all that far apart. So John Adams came back and then was elected to be vice president. And Thomas Jefferson came back thinking he was going to go back to France in 1789, and then realizes that he has been nominated as Secretary of State, which he then takes that office in 1790. At that point, they're still friends. They're on the same page. They therefore see each other a fair amount in Philadelphia. Well, first in New York, where the seat of government is, and then in Philadelphia. And I think the first real there are several little blips in the relationship where they start to see things differently. The first is over the presidency, what the presidency should look like, and what the powers of the presidency should be, and what the title for the presidency should be. This is where John Adams starts to lose some of his political credibility because he wants a more ostentatious title than Mr. President. And then I think the second, and perhaps the real challenge, is the French Revolution.
Jefferson was there. Adams was not. Jefferson left before the worst of it, of course.
Yes, Jefferson was there. Adams was not. Jefferson came back, was always very defensive of it and in favor of it. And Adams was like, I warned you guys, this is crazy.
Atheism, nightmare, class struggle, terrorism, etc. And Adams thinks that I'm sure like everybody else, he had an initial intriguing feeling about the French Revolution. Maybe the little flame that we lit was going to burn out tyrannies in the old world. But Adams was not a man that suffered from any illusions. He was a dark realist about life, and he believed, I think, that France was incapable of having a benign revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was also a pretty hard-nosed student of government institutions. And there was a real argument that France was not capable of having the type of revolution that the United States did, because the difference between the ancient regime, which was the regime under the king, and a revolutionary regime was so different that that kind of shift is almost impossible to happen overnight, but also almost impossible to happen peacefully and almost impossible to retain. Whereas if we look at the structure of government in the United States, the shift from the colonial governments to what happened afterwards are really not all that different. And most of the same people stay in power, which is why it works and why it actually survives. And I think that John Adams saw that, and Jefferson really loved the ideas of the revolution, and he believed in the ideas, and he believed that the ideas could win out over those institutions. And what Adams was basically saying was the ideas are great, but the realities on the ground are often more powerful.
Yes, you don't just have to pull down the Bastille. You have to pull down the tax system. You have to pull down the church. You have to pull down the aristocracy. There's so much that has to be done if you really mean revolution in France, whereas that really wasn't the case at all in the fledgling United States. But that I'm still not satisfied. Okay, so they disagreed. They disagreed strongly about this issue. But you know how Jefferson always says, we disagree, but we disagree as rational friends. So that doesn't necessarily break the friendship.
No. So they are starting to disagree more and more. They're a little bit wary of each other. Then the first real competitive election occurs in 1796. And at this point, they hadn't seen each other in a couple years because Jefferson had, quote unquote, retired in the end of 1793. So it goes home to Monticello. And so they don't see each other for a couple of years. And 1796 was the first competitive election. They do not participate. They stay home. They don't write anything. They don't say anything, but their supporters do, and their supporters can be quite vicious. Nonetheless, after the election, when it turns out that Adams came in first place, Jefferson came in second place, they're going to be president and vice president, they both make overtures to try and ensure that they're able to work together. And it's a big deal. And actually, Jefferson wanted to even make more of an overture, but Madison kind of reined him in at various points. Jefferson really turns from that almost immediately because he concludes that the cabinet is controlling Adams and Adams is looking for war with France. And at that point, he basically cuts off all ties. I mean, he still is in Philadelphia when government is in session and he sees the president, but he cuts off all ties and he really turns to the Republican Party. And Adams starts to hear reports of Jefferson's criticism of him, and that really ends the relationship.
You know, you said that they don't exchange much communication for a couple of years when Jefferson, quote unquote, retires. And he desubscribed to newspapers, and he said he only read Tacitus and Thucydides, and he wandered around the fields like a young man. And this was the end. His real happiness had always been at home, and politics was a disagreeable business, and the usual Jefferson stuff. And Adams said at some point, if you think he's just quietly going about his life out there, you're nuts. Jefferson's always got a plan. There's always a scheme. You know that under the radar here, things are happening. And of course, he was right. He was not 100% right, but Adams realized that Jefferson was too valuable to the country to really go silent, to retire. But also he realized that Jefferson, for all of his protestations of being a kind of another Cincinnatus, was a deeply ambitious human being, and also an ideologue who disliked the kind of federalism that he thought Adams was being controlled by.
Yes, and Jefferson was also intensely political and was good at it. And he both denied that he was and denied that he was good at it. And Adams was accurate in his assessment that that Jefferson was a very political person and had a lot of skills in that field.
Let's talk for a moment about Abigail Adams. So she and Jefferson had broken hard in 1804. We'll come to that in another one of our programs. But when that happened, they basically said to each other, I don't really care if I ever hear from you again. Not in so many words, but roughly that. As I understand it, Lindsay, when the intermediary of this thing, Benjamin Rush, was trying to convince each of them to renew the correspondence, Jefferson said, maybe, but I don't feel that I should ever have to communicate with Mrs. Adams again.
I want to know your perspective on why he was harsher towards her than he was to John. I know why she was harsher to Jefferson than John was.
Well, there are lots of things here. So, of course, Jefferson had not been a very loyal vice president. Jefferson had let party overwhelm the friendship. Jefferson had given money to James Callender, who wrote really disgusting, personal, mean-spirited, character assassination articles about John Adams. Also, Jefferson had canceled the midnight appointments, one of which inadvertently, I think, was John Quincy Adams. And so there was a little bit of that parental business. But mostly it was, how could you turn loose this scurrilous, irresponsible thug of a so-called journalist to write trash about my husband and then smile when we meet for tea? I think she was just appalled by that. And of course, she wasn't willing just to say, this bothered me. She had to get one real twist in at the end of this correspondence and saying, and speaking of this calendar, the serpent that you cherished in your bosom, she says, has turned on you. And she didn't say, how do you like it, Mr. Jefferson? But that was sort of the sense, like, you played with this fire. We all know what you really are like, Thomas Jefferson, and I want nothing more to do with you. And so I think she heard it, because if you look at all the correspondence in to Jefferson, Lindsay, almost nobody ever was that direct with him.
One of my favorite things about, the John and Abigail correspondence is, of course, unbelievable. But I think a close second for me in terms of my favorite is she was the most incisive, cutting, sharp observer of politics and humanity. I mean, she just saw exactly through everyone. And Jefferson was included in that bunch. And she was willing to call him out on it. And, I understand. I think we also, this is a very human trait. We are often willing to forgive people who harm us before we are willing to forgive people that harm those that we love. And that was certainly true with Abigail and John.
I think you're absolutely right. And of course, John Quincy Adams never really forgave Jefferson for Jefferson's attacks on his father or Jefferson, period. And so those two people who cared most about John Adams, John Quincy Adams, his son, and Abigail, were relatively unforgiving of Mr. Jefferson. And of course, in the correspondence between Abigail and Thomas Jefferson in 1804, she gets the best of it in every way, including on constitutional theory. Her sharpness was something that Jefferson could admire from a very long distance. And so his ideal woman is a kind of well-bred Virginia woman who can play the spinet and sing and dance and is pretty well read, but is very deferential and soft in her manners. That is not our Abigail Adams.
No, she was very challenging when she wanted to be. She told people when they were wrong, whether or not they wanted to hear it. And John, to his credit, recognized that she was an incredible asset and made him better. And to your point, Jefferson didn't particularly like that type of woman.
But he did respect her.
He did.
And that correspondence...
He just didn't always want to talk to her.
That correspondence really hurt him. She really got close to his deepest vulnerabilities with that series of letters. And so he says to Adams, or he says to Benjamin Rush, as long as I don't have to communicate with her. But then they both softened and they wrote some kind of polite letters to each other and eventually very friendly ones.
Yes, but don't you think that at least, well, it's my sense at least with Abigail, and I know we're going to talk more about this in a separate program, but I think she genuinely, when they were in France, she loved Jefferson and she valued his friendship. She valued that the friendship and the support it provided to John. She said at one point that Jefferson was the person he could be most himself with and most at ease. And they may have had friendly letters again, but that relationship was different and it was never going to go back.
We need to take a short break. We'll be back with Listening to America in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky and I talking about one of our very favorite subjects, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams has really had an upsurge over the past 25 years. He used to be kind of dismissed as cranky old John Adams and tedious John Adams, and now he's seen as human John Adams and refreshingly candid John Adams and more like us John Adams. And Joseph Ellis played a large role in that. You're playing a role in that. This is Adams' time.
It is, although it's interesting because when I talk to people about Adams now, especially if they don't know that I wrote a book on him, or if like I just mention it without really saying what it's about, the sort of baseline story is still that he was this grouchy, cantankerous person. And there's no doubt that he could be a curmudgeon, which I actually really enjoy. But I think that his sense of humor, his joy, the sense of vibrancy, and he genuinely loved people, some people. He genuinely loved some people. And I think a lot of those passions, that part still hasn't quite broken through. And I think that's because a lot of books, if they don't delve deep into him, if they just repeat old cliches, like, H.W. Brand's new book, Founding Partisans, repeats all of the cliches about Adams that were of the older generation, that he's this grumpy old man that has, nothing to contribute. It's really a shame because it doesn't depict the complexity of who he was and what he has to offer. And one of the things that I write is that some of the things that made him an anathema to his peers make him so much more accessible to us. Like you said, his humanness, his accessibility, those are qualities we really value. And they aren't necessarily qualities that his peers valued in the same way.
Fair enough. All right. We know why the friendship broke down. They could easily have just let it go. They're both retired. Jefferson is riding high. He's really taken control of America, and his two proteges are following pretty closely. It's a time of general peace, except for Mr. Madison's war, of course. The frontier is hopping. People are moving there. America's wealth is growing. Its population is growing. They could easily have just lived out their lives. They both had busy lives. Why did John Adams pick up his pen on January 1st, 1812?
So I think there are a couple of reasons. So the first, and Joe Ellis argues this in Passionate Sage, was that by that point, Adams had sort of worked through some of his bitterness. He had written his Boston Patriot letters describing his legacy as he saw it and trying to settle some old scores. So he'd kind of gotten a lot of that vitriol out of his system. Second is their mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, would not let up and was trying really hard to put them back together and sort of saw it as his personal mission to resume this friendship. And so he was writing to both of them. He was constantly talking about how great it would be, how he had this dream. He would then take passages that the other wrote about each other and edit them accordingly and send them along. So he was, constantly kind of not letting this go and putting it in Adams' ear. And then I do think the last piece was this closure element. Adams was really introspective and reflective about his own shortcomings. And I think that he wanted that closure. And so the friendship had meant a lot to him. And the note that it left on was so unpleasant that I think he was hoping, even if it didn't turn into the great correspondence that it did, I think he was hoping just for a little bit of a better end.
There were a couple early little hiccups, but the first time I really loved the letters is when, Jefferson writes an incredible letter back about, we go on puzzling and prospering beyond the dream. It goes right into the full Jefferson music about you and I, however much we have disagreed, so much time has passed, and America is this place that is going to change the world's view of the capacities of mankind. One of those Jefferson letters. And when he does that, they're magnificent. Even you have to acknowledge that. But in his fourth or fifth letter, Adams says, we must not die until we have explained ourselves to each other. I love that.
Well, both of those things are both so them. And that when John Adams received Jefferson's letter about, his full Jefferson treatment, he's like, aha, I have him. He's on the hook. He's fully engaged, or as fully as engaged as he could be. And I imagine him getting it and him just being like, yes. I just, I said this at the beginning, but the thing that I love about this letter is it reveals themselves for, even if they are not being fully themselves with each other, it reveals them to us as to who they are. And we have a much better sense of who they are through this correspondence.
At some point, they realized that these letters were going to be part of the record, that these could not be suppressed as merely private. And people were opening their mail. The post office was very unreliable, let's put it. Jefferson was always worried about that. Like, what if something got into the wrong hands? Is it fair to say that the debate, let's call it, between Jefferson and Adams about, yes, we both want a republic, but what does that really mean? And how much control can you really give the people to chart their own destiny? What are the filters? What are the checks and balances? Remember, Adams says, checks and balances, Mr. Jefferson, checks and balances. So that seems to me to be the actual debate. And Hamilton, brilliant financier and a great man in his own way, was really a different sort of thing, almost an outlier to this debate, because Jefferson and Adams both wanted the same thing, a vibrant republic. But Adams' view was sort of look around at human nature and say, we're going to build in some controls here, Mr. J. And Jefferson's view was, we have never really seen what humans could do if they were liberated. And I think that's the debate, and it's so moving to watch them. Do you think that Adams needed to be vindicated? He needed Jefferson to accept that Adams wasn't a kind of a silly aristocratic monarchist with a ceremonial sword and a pompous title. Do you think he ever got the acknowledgement, the vindication that he said he needed from Jefferson in the correspondence?
Well, first, I think you're totally right about the Hamilton-Jefferson debate is much more about process than it is about concept. But with Adams and Jefferson, you're right. They both do want a republic. They just have a very different sense of where the danger lies. And Adams sees danger in a lot of places, and Jefferson sees danger in fewer places. He sees danger in concentrated power, whether it's an aristocracy or a monarchy. And Adams says, yes, I agree, those things are dangerous, but so too are the people, because a majority without any checks is really can be quite awful. And he points to the French Revolution as an example. I think that he probably actually got what he wanted, in that I think by the time that they died, I think Jefferson probably understood that Adams was a fervent patriot and did want a republic, even if they disagreed what exactly that looked like. But I'm not sure that Jefferson ever acknowledged that as much as Adams would have liked.
Was Adams lifted in the nation's mind because Jefferson took the time to treat him with that kind of deep respect in those years?
Yes, but I'm not sure it was because Jefferson corresponded with him. I think it was more that they were reminded that they had been partners in the Revolutionary Project. And so it reminded the American people that Adams had played a really integral role in the founding of the nation.
In my calculation, Lindsay, there's only one time where Jefferson says, you were right, to Adams, and that's on the French Revolution. He, at some point, Adams is not going to let the French Revolution go. And at some point, Jefferson says,
a dog with a bone.
You were right. I miscalculated. I thought it would end in a free and well-tempered republic. It didn't. I'm so sorry. It should have. But I was wrong. And I think that's the only time in those 14 years that Jefferson ever says, okay, fair enough. You won that one. I want to make sure we only have about 10 minutes here. I want to make sure we get a couple of the great letters in. I don't know what your nominations will be, but one is the question about aristocracy. So this is in 1814. Jefferson's view is essentially that aristocracy by birth is a terrible problem for a society, and we have to do what we can to make that difficult. But there is a natural aristocracy, you and I would call it a meritocracy, and the great society is the one that knows how to find its natural aristocrats wherever they are born. Jefferson goes so far to say is in a hovel, in a wigwam, on the prairies. But the great society finds out its natural aristocrats and lifts them into positions of usefulness or authority. And Adams' view was, okay, sure, I'm all for merit, but that's not how it works, Mr. Jefferson. There are people that are just born privileged. There are privileged families. There are clans. There are legacies. Don't you ever think that merit alone is going to prevail in this our happy republic. And Adams says, we may as well give them the Senate. Yeah, because they're going to take care of themselves. So we'll put them in the Senate. There we can kind of watch them. We can keep an eye on them.
Yeah. And, and I think that Adams saw a concentration of elite power, if it was cordoned off, which the Senate was, as a useful tool, because he recognized that there was going to be a accumulation of power in someone's hands. And so, may as well make it useful to the American people. And I think that was an anathema to the pure concept of republicanism as Jefferson saw it.
Adams says with his usual lovely Adams approach, like, the beautiful woman's always going to outdistance the not beautiful woman, and the strong man's always going to be more powerful than the weaker man, and the tall man, and wealth, and that these things will always prevail over merit, or at least they have to be factored into any world in which you're seeking merit, and that there's no amount of leveling or reconstruction or Maoist moving people into the rice fields for re-education. It just doesn't happen. Society shakes down, and there are people of privilege, and it turns out to be hereditary, and we may as well just face that.
Yeah, there's some truth to that. One of the things that I find compelling about Adams is sometimes his dark view of humanity parallels my own. But he also has a wonderfully, incredible lightness to him, which is one of my favorite letters. So it's actually an incredibly dark time. So after Abigail died, it was in the newspapers, and Jefferson wrote a letter to Adams, which was incredibly kind and lovely.
Beautiful.
And
one of the best condolence letters ever written.
Oh, it's just so unbelievably thoughtful. And Adams writes back, and what he says, it's so lovely. He says, I believe in God and in his wisdom and benevolence, and I cannot conceive that such a being could make such a species as the human merely to live and die on this earth. He then, he says a little bit more, and he says, and if there be a future state, why should the Almighty dissolve forever all the tender ties which unite us so delightfully in this world and forbid us to see each other in the next? And so what he's basically saying is, he's talking about how incredibly difficult this time is, but that he's going to see her again. And it's just so sweet. And, at this point they had been married for such a long time, and they still had this incredible love and affection for one another. And it's really very lovely.
So let me read this magnificent letter from Jefferson to Adams, November 13th, 1918. The public papers, my dear friend, announced the fatal event of which your letter of October 20 had given me ominous foreboding. Tried myself in the school of affliction by the loss of every form of connection which can rive the human heart. I know well and feel what you have lost, what you have suffered, are suffering, and have yet to endure. The same trials have taught me that for ills so immeasurable, time and silence are the only medicines. I will not therefore by useless condolences open afresh the sluices of your grief, nor although mingling sincerely my tears with yours, will I say a word more, where words are vain, but it is of some comfort to us both that the term is not very distant, at which we are to deposit in the same cerement our sorrows and suffering bodies, and to ascend in essence to an ecstatic meeting with the friends we have loved and lost, whom we shall still love, and never lose again. God bless you and support you under your heavy affliction. Makes you almost forgive him, doesn't it? Nobody else can do that. Nobody else can do that.
Well, and also, what is beautiful about that letter is not only is it extraordinary and meaningful and so touching, but it also was perfectly tailored to Adams. So it's not the type of generic prose that would work for everyone. And so that's really, I think, actually where it's extraordinary.
One of his greatnesses, but also something that frustrates people, is that Jefferson writes the letter to the person that he thinks the person should hear, and doesn't always write the letter of what he actually feels and thinks. And so people believe that the difference between the super polite, super civilized Jefferson and his actual views were troubling, because you couldn't necessarily count on Jefferson. You didn't know whether he really meant it, because he might be writing to Madison like, I told him they'd see each other in heaven, but we both know. Of course, he wouldn't on a subject like that, but there's that issue with Jefferson, right?
I do think, though, that in this case, I would like to believe because, and I do think that he was writing what he felt that Adams needed or wanted to hear. But I think in this case, I'm willing to extend a lot of grace to Jefferson because his darkest moment was after he lost his wife. And so he would have understood, especially because he did have a pretty intimate look at what the Adams marriage was like because he was with them in France and he knew that they were partners and how close they were and how much they valued one another. And so he would have known, I think, the pain of that, unlike most people.
Agreed. And of course, he must have, in some sense, envied Adams to have a long, long, beautiful marriage, whereas Jefferson's was cut short when his wife was just 33, and he never remarried, although we know that he found other solace. We're out of time. We just have time for a couple more minutes here, Lindsay. I want to quickly ask you about another of my favorite letters where Adams says, I'm going to ask you the most frivolous question you've ever been asked. Would you be willing to live your life over again? And Jefferson says, yes, of course. I steer my bark with hope ahead and fear astern. I would live my life again and again as often as the Creator allows. But I will ask you this one question. What is the use of grief? And remember that letter?
Yes.
And then Adams has to reply.
They're grief letters.
The grief letters.
Their grief letters are so good because this is an example of where Adams genuinely wants to debate and to discuss and to like get at it. And Jefferson's like, will you leave me alone? And he's, talking about how grief is, and this is, we should say, this is not around the Abigail death letters. This is when they're talking about grief in a very vacuum space. And Adams is like, this is how useful grief can be. And he's listing all these things. And Jefferson's like, no, it's not useful. And he just like,
no, there's no use.
Will not let it go. And so Adams writes several letters on the value and the purpose of grief and how it's important to humanity. And it's very funny.
But he also says, so you want to talk about the uses of grief? How about let's talk about the abuses of grief? He always wants to do the abuses of power, the abuses of grief, the abuses of everything. So you could just see when Jefferson writes back that letter, like, no, I reject this. I just reject grief. A God that we can really believe in would have found a better mechanism for loss than this. And Adams is like, no, it supples us for the inevitability of our own death, and it humbles us, and it teaches us non-attachment. And Jefferson's just like gritting his teeth. And that Adams said, but having exhausted that subject, now let me talk about the abuses of grief. And he goes into the mourning over George Washington's death. Like, boy, the people really laid it on for Washington, didn't they?
They did. They kept at it for years. Like they had, it was actually really pretty interesting as I was going through, like Congress just kept being like, oh, we should have more ceremonies. Oh, we should do more things for over a year. It really was a little bit excessive.
Sputtering. John Adams is a sputterer. And I'm sure Jefferson thought, where's the self-censor in this guy?
Well, and it's funny because in that moment, I'm sure actually Jefferson did agree that the mourning over Washington was really quite excessive because he felt that was inappropriate to a republic in which a former president had gone back to civilian status. Yeah, Adams just cannot stop. He just has to keep going.
So last quick question. We're really, truly out of time. What do we learn from this extraordinary correspondence besides the two men trying to work out some things in their late life?
Gosh, there's so much we can take from it. I think that in some ways it's a marvelous bookend to their partnership. The 50 years between the Declaration and their death is extraordinary and such an important period of American history. I think that we see both of them in honest light by reading this correspondence. I think that we see them in a way that they are not with most other people. And the value, therefore, that the relationship and the correspondence brings both to their lives, but also to the historical record.
I know it's moronic for me to say this, Lindsay, but you just wish that every member of Congress would read this correspondence and go and hug somebody across the aisle and say, we probably could find a way to communicate these things. And then, cool. They die on the 4th of July within 5 hours of each other. What a way to put a capstone, to put a period, a full stop on this extraordinary friendship between two of the greatest individuals in American history. Thank you, Lindsay. We'll see you another time. We're going to be talking about Jefferson and Abigail Adams' 10 Things. Quite a different conversation. To all of you, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.